Okay, thank you. I will not be talking about architecture so much today, but more about the social system in China. And as many of you who have been to China perhaps probably know, this is what China for the last 5 or 10 years has looked like. When you travel through the cities, you don't really see the cities that much because they're being constructed right now. And they're being filled in scaffolds, or they're being built behind fences. Yet at the same time, you already, if you look through the scaffolding, you can see some shapes emerging. And when Neville approached me to join this project, his question was, well, we're seeing all these new buildings and architecture and city planning emerging, but what about the society itself? What kind of a new China or a new idea of what a city is emerging? And that's what I would like to talk about today. This idea of the Chinese dream, the title of the book, a new mythology of what it is to be Chinese, what it means to live in China. And I will do that by looking at 4 different parts. I've called my presentation the city, the citizens, an astronaut, and the system. I will first have a look at what is this ideal city of the Chinese dream, how is it represented, how is it being talked about. The next step is what are the citizens, the people who live in the city, how are they experiencing these new cities, how are they looking upon the new cities that are being built. And then we'll make a small excursion from China to outer space, because I find the Chinese space program a very interesting metaphor to understand what's happening in China, but I'll come back to that later. And after that, we'll have a short look at what's happening with the whole system in China. And this is another one of those fences that I saw, I think, in Beijing. Behind this fence, a city is being built, and I'm not sure if you can really read it, but it says, "City full of vigor, place, realize the dream." So behind this fence, the Chinese dream is being built, and of course it's being built by these people who are migrant workers who've came into Beijing and who will probably never be able to afford the places that they're building. In the book, we have a glossary, and we've defined the Chinese dream as follows. It's an aspirational drive for individual prosperity within a modern urban setting. Consumer desire keyed into traditional family structures focuses on home and car ownership over political change. So this idea of the Chinese dream is the idea to live a comfortable middle-class life in a modern city or a modern suburb, as Neville has pointed out just now. We also came up with this extra definition from the perspective of the Communist Party. Of course, the dream is continuing assured Chinese Communist Party rule, preferably with moon landings. And of course, the idea is that this mythology of this Chinese dream, so this idea of having this middle-class life, is for a big part also the justification of the system, because they're promising that new and modern life to the people. That's also part of what the power of the Communist Party is based on. So let's have a look at the city, because this whole idea of having a city as a prosperous place, it's really quite new in China. If you look at all the propaganda from the era up to the beginning of the 1980s, there's hardly ever a city in sight. You always see a lot of industry, there is the countryside, there is infrastructure, bridges, roads, trains, etc. But there's hardly ever talk of a city, because the communists at that time, they didn't really like the city at all. For them, the city was a capitalist place, a place of consumption, and they wanted to build a country of factories for the workers. So there wasn't much attention for cities at all. And that didn't change until after the Cultural Revolution, end 1970s, begin 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping took power, and he started his politics of opening up and building cities that should or accelerate the Chinese economy. And these are some of the first examples of where we're seeing cities in propaganda material. These are all pictures from one-child family campaigns. This one is still an old one. You see there is a troop of people going into the countryside explaining about the one-child policy. But here already we see a happy woman with a child in a modern city. And this one is a mosaic that I saw in Shenzhen, a city just across the border from Hong Kong in the south of China. Again, it's promoting the one-child policy, and we're seeing a happy, modern dressed, modern, wealthy couple, but here we're seeing some skyscrapers and a big city. So this happy family belongs in the city, so to speak. Here are some other examples of propaganda from the early 80s. Still some references to the countryside with modern housing, and here the countryside has disappeared and it's only modern buildings. And this is a billboard that you find again in Shenzhen. This is Deng Xiaoping, and I think in the 90s you saw a lot of billboards like this. Again, the modern city with its skyscrapers and glass and steel towers, but very important, you see a political figure at the foreground, because it was his idea to actually build the city there. So the political party more or less willed that city into being. And almost we see him also overlooking the city, and he sees that it all was good. But if you look around China right now, you still see some of these billboards with the political leaders, but more and more you see a different kind of billboards. The political leaders have gone, and these are the billboards of the new China that is actually being built. These are the images being put up by the developers, and they show you beautiful apartments, modern architecture, often with luxurious names, and a lot of lifestyle aspects are stressed. You can live a beautiful, nice, comfortable life in a big apartment in the city. Here is another one in Beijing, and I found this somewhat metaphorical for this whole idea of the Chinese dream, because this is, of course, a city that it has not been built, but it's going to be built right there if the developer will get all the money and succeed in getting all the permits and everything. And here we see a bike repairman who is working there on the sidewalk, who is one of those Chinese who might be aspiring to one day live in one of those apartments. And if not he himself, because he's only a simple bicycle repairman, then maybe his children, if he's able to send them to university, they will one day be able to live in one of those apartments. And you see those images of a modern city with skyscrapers, high density, luxurious life. You don't only see it on project developers, billboards, but you see it in all kinds of aspects of culture in China right now. This is a building, a painting in Shanghai. I think it was a project done by a school who painted, again, on fences behind which was being built, their imaginations of the city. And this is the skyline of Shanghai, and again, there is astronauts in space. China is a modern country. And this is an advertisement for a bank, also again, skyline, beautiful buildings, modern architecture, etc., etc. And this is a postcard that I bought in Shenzhen. And I think it's a very interesting postcard, because it's a far step from the first images I showed you from the rural countryside. Of course, we still see the infrastructure. It reminds me a little bit of postcards I've seen from Rotterdam in the early 50s with the Hofplein centered on it. Again, the idea is we're modern countries, we're having modern infrastructure, but look at the city. It's almost post-industrial. There is not a single chimney inside anymore. It's all apartments, offices. The industry has almost vanished. And that's remarkable, because Shenzhen was the first modern city in China, built in the 80s, and it became a big city because of the industry. A lot of investors went there, and they set up a lot of factories. So a lot of our shoes and all the toys in the world are actually all made in this city. But at this point in time, they don't want to be an industrial city anymore. They want to make the next step. They want to become an information city. And this is a video, a promotion video of the city of Shenzhen, where they're showing off the city to prospective investors and people who live there. And again, we're seeing the usual images of the modern buildings. And I will speed it up a little bit here. There's even a monorail, and there's also parks and golf courses. And there is some places for tradition, but not too much, because Shenzhen is above all a young and energetic city. So the way the city is being sold to the Chinese people, investors, is a city where you can have fun, where you can dance on the beach, where you can have parties, where there are skateboarders. It's not a city where people are working hard or where a lot of industry is, but it's a fun place to be. And we'll speed it up. You can go shopping as well, which is also an important part. You can buy lots of stuff and eat in expensive restaurants. And life is almost like a vacation. And is there no industry at all? Yes, a little bit, but it's all high-tech industry right now. So, and these are some banners I found on the internet a few years ago. Again, the city is promoted as the city of joy. Shenzhen welcome you. And here they're going even over the top, represents too much splendors and wonders. This is a boundless ocean of joy. So the idea of the city that's being presented to the Chinese public is really a place where you can live a happy life, where couples live in apartments, where you can go to parks, where they can own a car, etc., etc., etc. But that idea, the way it's represented in all these places, is quite different from much of the China that it replaces, or that is actually still there. This is a picture taken in Suining, which is a little village in central Sichuan, and this is, I guess, your average Chinese village somewhere in the middle of China. And the street life that you see here is very different from the one that is being proposed in all the advertisements and the commercials. It's a little bit chaotic. There is a lot of informal economy on the street level, little shops, people just selling stuff on the sidewalks. And in those other representations, you don't see that at all. I mean, it's all official economy, everything is regulated. It looks more like a shopping mall than like a street where people interact or where there is things going on. Yet this is the China that's disappearing, and that's being replaced by the imagery that we've been seeing now. And to our great surprise, because Neville and I and some other people of the team, we went to this village and we went to the planning office, and they showed us a video of how they wanted to remake this village, and it looks like this. So also here, in a little village, somewhere in the middle of the Sichuan province, which is not really the center of things, they're dreaming of building a city like the one we've seen in Shenzhen, with high-tech zones, with offices, and modern apartment buildings as well. So this is the image that's being put forward of the Chinese cities. But what about the people who live in there? Do they buy this? Do they really aspire to those images? And when I was in China doing research for the book, I talked, of course, with a lot of people, and I'll share some quotes with you to give you an idea. And I also show you some pictures of the people I talked to. The quotes and the people that you see in the pictures, they're not necessarily the same people. This is a couple in Shanghai taking an outing to a little temple. And this is a quote from somebody who lives in Shenzhen. And this was a young college graduate student who was very, very excited to be in Shenzhen. He said, "I was so excited when I landed at the airport. I felt the same way the Chinese who emigrated to America 100 years ago must have felt. Shenzhen is the city of liberty, the city of opportunity, and now I'm here." This whole idea of the modern Shenzhen as a modern city has become a mythology that people have been repeating and talking to each other all over China. And you see references to it in the literature in the early 90s, even in some villages in the middle of the country. The high schools are called Shenzhen High School because they hope that the people from that school will go to these cities. So he really had this excited feeling when he was coming. This is another person I met in Chongqing, but the quote is still about Shenzhen. And this guy said, what we want to do, our generation, we want to build up our country. That's the dream of all the young people in Shenzhen. We want to buy a car, an apartment, and raise a family. So I guess this is more or less the Chinese dream in a nutshell. And he went on and he said, we don't need a history here. We are creating it, and we are proud of it. That's our culture. So he said, it doesn't really matter that we're getting rid of all the old buildings that were here. We're creating history right now, and that's what we're proud of being part of. This is another family in Chongqing, and a young girl who's going to one of the better high schools over there, and who's hoping to enter into one of the better universities as well. In their, I would say, I guess this is somewhat typical middle-class apartment right now in China. And I think it's also interesting because it's a combination of, on the one hand, a modern furniture and design, and on the other hand, there are all kind of traditional feng shui elements that you see in the way that it's been decorated. And this girl said, we are very different from our parents. They always had to do what they were told by the Communist Party. They couldn't decide anything for themselves. We are different. We set our own goals. We want certain things, and we work towards them. So not only is there this aspiration of having a comfortable life in a big city, but it's also being framed as something that's within reach if you just set your goals and you start working towards them. Of course, so far we've seen all middle-class people who are lucky to actually be able to take part of that. But what about this guy? He lives in this tent on the street in Beijing, and he lives in there with 12 other people from a small village. And they've come to Beijing to make the streets. And his colleagues are all working, but his duty today is to watch the tent and to cook food for them. And of course, in the big cities, there's millions of people like this who are actually building the city. And if you talk to them, then they often see themselves somewhat of a lost generation. They went through the Cultural Revolution. They didn't have any chances to develop themselves during that time. They don't really like all the modernization or the chances. They're not really buying into that myth of the Chinese dream, except that they're really hoping that for their children it will become a reality. This guy said, next year my son will go to university. But that's very expensive. Tuition is now, well, at the time I talked to him, 7,000 renminbi, so 700 euros almost a year. And he was only making 500 renminbi a month. So the tuition for his son would be more than his annual salary. So the solution was that his wife would go to a different city and work there and also make some money, and then they would put that together, and maybe the grandparents had some savings, and they would use all that money to put their kids through college, hopefully so that they would be able to be part of the Chinese dream. So now we're going to make a short excursion to outer space, because last week there was another example of the Chinese space program. They even made a space walk outside. And I think the space program gives an interesting view into another way of how this new mythology of the Chinese dream is being distributed, sold to the people. This guy is Yang Liwei. He was the first astronaut in China. He was put in space in 2003. And after that, he became a national hero, and there were all kind of rallies staged for him where people shouted that they were very proud that China had an astronaut as well, and that they were a modern country, and this capsule went around the country so everybody could see it. And of course, the space program is just like the cities. It's a symbol that China is a modern country, it has the technology, it can compete with Russia and America, and it's a drive for nationalist proud. But it's more than that. The astronaut was presented in some ways as a traditional Chinese hero, a role model, like this guy, in the way he was photographed, the iconography. This is Lei Feng. He was a hero, probably an invented hero during the Chinese Civil War. And he's in all the history books, and all the Chinese children, they have to learn about him. And they don't only have to learn about him, but also from him. And the lesson is, they have to learn is, this is one of his quotes. He said, "I'm a screw that never rusts, sticking to the place where the party assigned me." So in other words, my own individual identity or wishes or whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's a collective, it's China that's really important, and I will do whatever the party or the country wants from me and where they need me. But then if we look at Yang Liwei, he also went around the country and people came together in big football stadiums and they cheered him. And in Hong Kong, for example, he was there together with Jackie Chan, and I think 40 or 50,000 people showed up and they sung a song. And he also had some lessons that people had to learn from him. But those lessons are very different from Lei Feng. The lesson that people have to learn from Yang Liwei, you could say, is this is one of his quotes. It says, "You must always believe that you will realize your dreams, even if they seem impossible." So that's a huge leap from this one guy who's saying, well, I will be doing whatever the party needs from me, wants from me. That's not what Yang Liwei said. He said, I became an astronaut because when I was a small boy, I wanted to become an astronaut. And then I always studied hard and always did my best. And finally, I was able to realize my dream. With other words, it's your own responsibility. Learn from my lesson, work hard, do your best, and the Chinese dream perhaps will be yours. And something else that was interesting happened as well at the same time. The space program wasn't only used in nation building and getting out lessons about this mythology, like the one I showed you, but it was also for the first time used in all sorts of commercial campaigns that made references to the space program. So this is a commercial for chewing gum, and here's one for mobile phones. So again, just like we saw in the city clip, or the film clip I showed you about Shenzhen, where a city is about having a fun, interesting consumer culture in a big city, where people take responsibilities. Also, the whole space program is being, well, one of the ways it's being framed is more or less in the same way. So that brings me to the fourth and last part of my presentation, because I started to wonder, I mean, if a society is somewhat changing from a collective system where people are more or less doing what they're being told, to a system where people actually are told to take responsibility, to shape their own lives, what does that mean for the system, for the whole political system, the way the country is run? Will all these people, if they learn that they have to take their own, realize their own goals, will they become more active? Will they demand more rights for themselves as well? Especially in a time when technology, with mobile phone, internet, SMS, etc., makes it easier for them than ever to express what their individual wishes are, to find others who share the same goals, to link up, to come into action. Could we expect something to be changing in the system, perhaps? And again, it really depends who you ask. These are some people I interviewed in Chengdu, and these are people who may have to make place for the Chinese dream of other people. They live in a small hutong in the middle of the city, and the house will be pretty soon, or probably by now, it's been bulldozed away to make room for all the new apartment towers that I've been showing you earlier. And if you ask people like this how they feel about that, then they will probably tell you something like, this quote is actually not actually from these people, but from some other people that I interviewed. And they say, well, you can't really do anything. Politics in China is something that just happens to you. They decide, and there's nothing you can do. It's like Confucius said, you can't really control your circumstances. The only thing you can do is trying to make the best of it. But I was wondering, you know, would people like these people, the upcoming middle classes, who were being told to think for themselves, to take their own lives in their hand, would they have the same attitude towards the government, towards the political system, as those other people, or was something maybe changing? And I talked with a lot more people, and one of them said, well, you know, I don't like our government so much. They do not inform us very well. When we had the SARS epidemic, it was very hard to get real information, but now we have the internet. There we can find the truth, or at least we can find different angles to the truth. So this was one of the first conversations in which I sensed that perhaps something is changing. Perhaps, you know, new technologies are giving people some sort of sense that they can actually take their life into their own hands, and that maybe something was going to change because of the internet or the technologies. And we were continuing this conversation, but it was a girl I was talking to, she said, well, you Western people, you think too big. You always come up with human rights and all that. But for us in China, that is not the most important issue. For us, politics is not that important. We are much more interested in information for for example, for about food safety. Of course, a very recent theme that has come up over the last few weeks with the tainted milk scandal. But actually what she was saying was that, you know, all these new technologies, it would already be really wonderful for us if we could use them to organize ourselves to get certain things done. She gave another example. She said, well, for instance, one of my friends, she bought a house from a developer, but when she actually got the key, she discovered that the house didn't look like the one on the billboards at all. There was no swimming pool, there was no golf course, the roof leaked, etc., etc. But in China, in a situation like that, it's very hard to actually sue a developer, for instance, because the system, you know, the commercial interests and the political interests and the judicial system, they're all very much interlinked. So even if you have actually right to do something and you will go to the court to appeal, then often they will send you away because they're so much interlinked with the commercial interests. But she said what happened there was that some of those people actually got together and they used communication technologies to organize themselves and to really, that way you're not just an individual who is approaching the court, but to create a pressure group and maybe do something about these unfair situations that you see all over China. I mean, all over China, people are being kicked out of their lands, or they're being promised all kinds of fees, but they've never been paid. And usually the ones that are involved in that get away with that. And she said, well, what you're seeing right now is actually for the first time that people in small groups are getting together and organizing themselves. And maybe this could be the start of something you could call a civil society. And this is an example of a website that has collected all sorts of examples of actually food poisoning. So all kind of products that had been tainted by some sort of poison or scandal or everything, just as a means of exchanging information, you know, within society about events like this. But then I've talked to a lot of people about these issues, and there is really two views on what's going to happen next. I mean, there is one view are the optimists, and they're saying, look, I mean, we're seeing websites like these or other websites where people who are working towards a better environment are organizing themselves. There are some lawyers here and there who are picking up cases and who are really trying to go to the courts. So yes, something is changing in China. But there is also a lot of pessimists who are saying, well, I mean, these examples, how many of them are there? I mean, there are 3 or 4 or 5 in a country of, you know, 1.5 billion people, 1.2 billion people. It's really very small amount of examples that have been really successful in doing something like this. So it really depends who you ask, which way it's going, and perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion afterwards, because I think it's an interesting question. So I wanted to round it off with another photo that I found very symbolic for what I saw was happening in China. This was a photo that was taken by a photographer from the New York Times right after China lost the final of the Asian Cup soccer in 2004. And what are we seeing? We're seeing, this is actually a commercial for, I always forget, is it Adidas or Nike? Adidas. Impossible is nothing. And that's pretty close to the myth of the Chinese dream and the way it's being represented by Yang Li Wei. You have to work towards your own dreams. And here is a very overjoyed, you could say, almost too much joy, too much splendor, very enthusiastic people rushing forwards because they're embracing the new modernity, the new Chinese dream that is being sold to them. And they're very enthusiastic and they're really eager to go forward. But at that night, something happened because during the final, the referee gave Japan a penalty. Of course, he should never have done that, according to the Chinese, because it wasn't the fall. But anyways, the Chinese kicked the penalty in. Japan won the final, and this whole enthusiasm, well, this is a soccer team, but the enthusiasm of the fans in the stadium, it turned around and it became a riot. And that's why you see the the police, and they're some sort of a, not very transparent, but there's some sort of a force, the powers who are trying to contain the enthusiasm of the crowds who maybe want more from their lives, but there's always also the danger that the crowds maybe turn angry when the Chinese dream that they've been, that's been sold to them doesn't really come out. Because, you know, for many, of course, the Chinese dream is something that will happen in the future. So it leaves a lot of questions. What's going to happen? I mean, will people stay enthusiastic about the dream? Will they get disappointed? What will happen with people in power? Will they become more transparent because they have to open up information, you know, in things like the current food crisis, or will they try to keep things in tight control? And those are some questions perhaps interesting for the discussion later on. Okay, thanks for your attention.
Martijn, wil je nog even blijven? Thank you, Martijn, for your presentation. Before we move on to the next speaker, I'd like to take some questions from you and maybe ask one myself. I think you'll remember my sharp reaction when I left China 4 years ago, and I left you guys in Chengdu. My feeling was that many of the changes that were occurring and the dream that they were pursuing was, in many ways, they were reconstructing a cliche of the West in a lot of ways. And it turned me off in a lot of ways, especially the consumption patterns and so on. How do you feel about that? Do you still see this? Is this growing? Do you even agree with me?
I think, well, for example, if you look at architecture, the early examples were really cheap copies of the West. You know, a lot of the buildings that were actually being built, the architectural style, the Chinese themselves, they refer to it as Euro style, because it was sort of a pasted together Austrian columns and Roman curls and whatever, and you know, some cheap imitations of Western architectural styles, and also the lifestyle aspects. But I think over the years they've become more sophisticated in a lot of these things. And if you look at, for example, the new town hall that's being built in Shenzhen right now, I don't really like it that much myself, the architecture, but the premise is very different from those first, because what you're seeing is actually a very modern building, and it's very big, but the roof is inspired on a peacock. So it's somewhat curved like that. So the statement that's being made is, look, I mean, we're a modern country and we're having a very modern city hall, but this modernity will definitely be a Chinese modernity. And in the beginning, people really, you know, like the person in the book who I quote, who says, we don't need history, we are creating it. That's a very extreme one. I mean, there is also a lot of people right now who are actually starting to look for roots, and I'm seeing this actually more and more over the last few years. You see stories of, you know, people who've been working in Shanghai for 5 years, for example, at investment banks and making lots of money and really embracing the dream, and then they start to realize, it's somewhat empty, and they start looking for history and roots. So, I mean, I only had 25 minutes, so maybe my story was a little, you know, one-sided. But for everything I've shown, there's probably also a countercurrent going against it.
Yeah, I was wondering, because this is like something that puzzles me, because in the Western media there's always this kind of criticism of China, that there's no free media, there's no possibility of criticism, but as soon as like Western observers and Western journalists go to China, they seem to very much copy this kind of behavior of being very uncritical in their observations. They're far more interested in looking at the emergence of this kind of new middle class that is sort of embracing Western consumption patterns. But at the same time, I mean, you cannot ignore the fact that in China, this is where sort of the global working class is at, no? Where everything is being produced that is coming into the harbor here in Rotterdam. So I was wondering about that. How is this strange contradiction, no? That within sort of liberal theory, it's the middle class that will produce the contention, no? They will ultimately establish democracy. But I think it's very strange that we don't see any focus on the contention that is for example, coming from Shenzhen, where iPod City is one of the biggest factories in the world, no? There were like millions and millions of people working there under really, really fucked up working conditions. So I was wondering why isn't in the Western perspective more attention for like these kind of contradictions within China's emergence, and like, do you know anything about sort of whether there is any contestation on that level?
Yeah, thanks for your remark. I'm not sure because I've also come across a lot of stories on the lower class and people working in the factories, and I've been to some of the factories myself as well. And in the art, you see, for example, the Chinese art. There's a lot of criticism as well about this whole new consumer culture, and there's a lot of people who are photographing or making models of the migrant workers. From my own observations in Shenzhen, for example, where I visited a factory, it's a bit double because, well, in the factories is a lot of young girls working there who are coming from the countryside, and the conditions under which they're working is really terrible. They're working 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week. Of course, there's lax safety regulations and all that. Yet, if you talk with them, in the beginning, they're still very excited about being in the big city as well. So, in the beginning, they buy into this dream of the Chinese dream. That really told you, like, and then I came to the city and I was amazed, and maybe they only have one free Sunday afternoon a month, but then they went to the shopping mall and they saw this amazing world that they could never dream of. I mean, that's the initial phase. But then when they get older, because they usually come there when they're 16 or 17, when they're older, 21 or 22, they usually are fired because the factory bosses, they prefer to have the young girls because they're more obedient. And then they see the other side of the system, and they become very much disappointed about this whole mythology of the Chinese dream. Many of them go back to the villages, try to do something there, or they get married, or do that. Another thing that I wanted to, because you mentioned one thing, you said that a lot of Western observers think that the middle class will eventually lead the way towards democracy. There's also a lot of theories who state the exact opposite, who's saying that no, the middle class is not going to bring democracy at all, because the middle class is actually really much working in collaboration with the Communist Party, because they want to protect their new wealth that they just have gained, and they're not interested in sharing it with all the other people that are there. But did that answer your question somewhat, or were you looking for something else?
Yeah. Okay. In any case, let's, in the interest of sticking to the agenda, let's move on to the next speaker, and we'll have time afterwards during the panel discussion. Thank you, Martijn.